Existentialism is the philosophical theory that existence precedes essence. That is, we are born into this world without a predefined essence. Since we are not endowed with a predefined essence, it is up to each of us to derive it for ourselves. So what does this existentialist assumption actually mean? In layman's terms, it means that you don't exist for a reason, you weren't born to do a certain thing or fulfill a certain destiny. No, instead you were born without purpose and you have to find some way to give your life meaning, whether you realize it or not. So why does this question of how we find meaning in our lives matter? Well, how we answer this question lays the foundation for most everything in our lives. Deciding and discovering what activities, pursuits, or values lead to a fulfilling life determines or at least impacts how we choose to live. One person might find meaning in something that makes them feel virtuous, like donating to charitable causes, while another might find fulfillment and pleasure in binging a television series for 3 days straight. Point being, we each have different sets of things that we value, and how we arrive at these determines what type of person we will be. Thus, how we decide what is meaningful is the defining question of our lives. At this point, you may be thinking, now that doesn't seem so bad. Even if I'm born without a specific purpose, there are lots of things I can pursue to add that to my life. But there's a catch. By counting on different things, whether it be activities, pursuits, or values, to give our lives meaning, we are relying on things that are themselves inherently meaningless. In philosophy, this is known as the problem of absurdity, where two opposite views or values collide. The reasoning here is circular. One meaningless thing pursuing another meaningless thing does not spontaneously create meaning. And since everything in the entire world has no predetermined essence, there is no way to objectively attain meaning or lead a meaningful life. So is meaning lost, or is there some metric we can apply to give our lives subjective meaning? We will examine two different approaches to this question in the form of two existential theories. The first is a secular approach initially proposed by Jean-Paul Sartre, an atheistic existentialist, and the second is a religious approach initially proposed by Søren Kierkegaard, a theistic philosopher. In articulating their theories, each author employs a hero figure that exemplifies certain qualities of the theory that the audience is intended to admire. By examining the champions of both theories, we can gain a clear understanding of how each author navigates the problem of absurdity. Sartre's proposed solution to the problem of absurdity comes in his work, Existentialism is a Humanism. As an atheist, Sartre rejects the existence of God, and this rejection has an important implication. It eliminates human nature, since there would be no God to have a conception of it. This puts every man in possession of himself as he is, and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders. This inability to defer responsibility is an important part and fundamental point of Sartre's theory. Sartre's hero figure is the decision maker. He describes the quandary of a young man that came to him seeking advice on how to decide between two apparently equal moral decisions. The young man had to decide whether to go off and join the military during wartime to fight for a cause that he believed in and to avenge his older brother's death, or to remain at home and take care of his aging mother, who, as Sartre describes, lived only for him. If he joined the war effort, his contribution would likely be of little consequence, but would be addressed to aid in a great national cause. Whereas if he stayed home, his efforts would only be directed toward one individual, but would be sure to benefit his mother's life. Morally, he could not decide which one was right. On the one hand was the morality of a much broader cause with debatable validity, and on the other, the morality of sympathy and personal devotion. As Sartre points out, these two choices are equally defensible, and no person or ethical scripture can objectively be used to determine which one is right. So how does the hero choose? Sartre asserts that the decision maker must go with his gut instinct. If he feels that he should go off to war, then going to war was the right decision. Similarly, if he feels he should stay home with his mother, then staying home was the right decision. As long as the decision maker chooses for himself without the influence of external factors or pressures, then he made the right choice, regardless of what he chooses. The reason the decision maker must be alone in his dilemma stems back to Sartre's assumption about human nature. individuals should not seek to defer responsibility for their choices by allowing themselves to be influenced by the opinions of others. Otherwise, their choice is not authentic. What the hero decides is not as important as how the hero decides it. As long as his decision comes from within, then it is right. Sartre's answer to the problem of absurdity is that whatever we choose to do is right and subjectively meaningful as long as the decision comes entirely from within us. Kierkegaard posed another solution to the problem of absurdity, or as he called it in his work Fear and Trembling, the paradox of faith. Kierkegaard's hero is the biblical figure Abraham, who was faced with an ethical and religious dilemma. The story goes that Abraham was commanded by God to offer his only son Isaac as a sacrifice. The absurdity of Abraham's decision is clear. He must choose between murdering his son, which is morally wrong, and his religious duty to obey the will of God. Kierkegaard claims that his hero Abraham was able to do both, obeying the will of God and fully trusting that his son would be spared. This belief that both opposing outcomes were possible is the concept of Abraham's faith. Kierkegaard demonstrates Abraham's faith by posing 4 alternative endings to the paradox of faith, each with slight alterations that shift the burden of proof away from faith. In the first, Abraham complies with God's will, sacrificing Isaac, but before he does so, he lies, claiming that he is an evil man murdering Isaac of his own volition. This would be intended to preserve Isaac's faith in God. If Abraham had done this, his attempt to salvage Isaac's faith would demonstrate that Abraham doubted his son would be spared. In the second, Abraham sacrifices the ram instead of Isaac, but never intended to kill Isaac. Here he fails to adhere to the will of God, and his faith will forever be compromised or lost because of God's command to kill his son. In the third, Abraham decides not to kill Isaac, and instead prays for forgiveness from God. Here he also fails to adhere to the will of God. In the fourth, Abraham goes to kill Isaac, but cannot follow through. As a result, Isaac questions and loses his faith after watching his father fail. Here again, Abraham fails to adhere to the will of God, and his son also loses faith as a result. By posing these alternative endings, and showing how they each fail to satisfy the paradox of faith, Kierkegaard more effectively shows how what Abraham actually does proves his faith, even though in the end he does not have to kill his son Isaac. Kierkegaard claims that Abraham's actions demonstrate that he genuinely intended to comply with God's will in killing his son, evidenced by the fact that he drew his knife. At the same time, he fully trusted that God would spare Isaac, evidenced by the fact that he never tried to deceive Isaac in order to preserve his son's faith. Abraham believed that in God anything is possible. His faith in the impossible was the only way he could overcome the absurdity of his position. So how does Abraham's overcoming of his absurdity help us tackle ours? Well, Kierkegaard generalizes Abraham's condition in the form of 2 nights, the night of resignation and the night of faith. When we confront absurdity, we can all, with some effort, relate to the night of resignation, acknowledging and resigning ourselves to the absurdity of our condition. We can accept existentialism and the conclusion that we exist in a world devoid of objective meaning and are unable to give our lives genuine purpose. However, if we, like Abraham, are able to reject the law of non-contradiction and have genuine faith in the impossible, we can go one step further and become the knight of faith. The knight of faith comprehends the absurdity of his position and chooses to have faith in the impossible anyway. Both Sartre and Kierkegaard propose solutions to the existential problem of absurdity, suggesting how we find meaning when we have none. Sartre suggests that we cannot overcome absurdity, but whatever we decide to do, as long as it comes from within, can be a source of subjective meaning, and that we should trust our gut to decide what is right and wrong. Kierkegaard suggests that through faith we can overcome absurdity. Although our position seems impossible, we should still hold fast to the belief that we can have a meaningful life in a meaningless world.